Hello, you're watching Talk On, the podcast of the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle, Germany. My name is Christoph Brumann.
And I'm Jovan Maud. And in this podcast, we're going to be talking about current research and debates in the field of social anthropology.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Talk On. As you can doubtlessly tell, I am neither Jovan nor Christoph. My name is Xenia Cherkaev, and I am a senior researcher here at the Institute. And today I am hijacking another episode of the Talk On podcast through the power of friendship and good personal ties with our excellent multimedia team here in Halle. To interview my really good friend and colleague, Amiel Bize, about our new special issue, which is forthcoming in the Journal of History and Anthropology. So, Amiel, welcome.
So exciting to be here.
Yes, Amiel Bize is an assistant professor at Cornell University. So, Amiel, this is a project that you and I have been working on for, I believe, a decade, is as of today. And I've noticed that over the years, as I have told people about Gleaning in this project, I get these really quizzical looks. People don't actually have a good concept of what gleaning is, a good definition of the term. And it's a term that I got from you. I didn't have any idea what it was either until you told me about it. So could you please tell everybody what gleaning is and how you maybe came to the concept?
Absolutely. Yeah. So gleaning is the practice of gathering leftovers. It's outlined in the Bible in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, where God declares that the landowner has an obligation to redistribute to the poor and the marginalized, has an obligation to allow these people to enter the field and to gather the leftovers of the harvest. Mm-hmm. So I didn't know very much about gleaning either, but when I was doing research in East Africa on fuel siphoners and truckers, I noticed that then when they were talking about these exchanges where fuel siphoners would basically buy fuel from truckers and they would siphon it directly out of their tanks. Mm-hmm. They would say, both the truckers and the fuel siphoners would say that what they were exchanging was a leftover. So the truckers would say that they had preserved this fuel as leftovers and that therefore they had a right to it, that the leftover was something that could be claimed. Mm-hmm. So I became really interested in what it was about the leftover that allowed these claims to be made. And I came to understand the leftover as a key to the kind of entirely, to the morality of this entire transaction, because for everyone, even though this is clearly an illegal act and for some also an illicit act, people consider this to be completely morally correct as a thing to do. And so I started thinking about the leftover in this context, right? And I think the leftover is a really fascinating concept because it's, on the one hand, it's a form of redistribution, at least in the biblical sense, but it's redistribution that's sort of ostensibly accidental. There's a kind of fictional accidentalness to this obligation, which I think is fascinating. And it's also extremely contextually specific, right? The leftover is something that can only be understood in context. And we see this in the way that it's described, for instance, in the Mishnah Peah, which are rabbinical commentaries on the Bible. They have all of these super specific ways of thinking about, well, what is and isn't a kind of thing that can be gleaned. So for instance, they say, that which falls off the back of the sickle or the back of the hand can be gleaned by the poor, but that which falls off the front of the sickle or the front of the hand when you're doing the harvest still belongs to the owners. And there's all kinds of like super specific determinations of this kind that I find super fascinating. I think there's something about the remainder, which is both a very interesting kind of share, a very interesting form of valuation, and also has this kind of moral connotation to it.
It's interesting because, I mean, there are all these rules, but in the end, in every particular case, it's actually kind of theft, isn't it?
Well, I mean,
that's the other way you can think about gleaning is field theft. Actually, I mean, that's one of the ways that people talk about it. And I know in your work, a lot of what I've read about it, there's, a lot of transactions that are happening, which are variously criminalized with the fuel, but also with, people taking stuff from trucks, passing by and all this stuff. So, what's the relationship between gleaning and illegality?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating because for many people, I think it would be easy to dismiss the sense of the leftover as, oh, this is just justification of what is actually theft, right? But I think you and I both agree that there's more, that there's more to this concept, right? That there's a kind of a really strong moral claim that is being made through the logic of the leftover. And that moral claim is about two kinds of obligation. It's about the obligation to redistribute, and it's about the obligation not to waste use values. So both of those obligations, I think, are really important. And it is this kind of positive entitlement, which it differs from the way that a lot of people talk about waste, which is a kind of negative entitlement. It's like a negative reason to not let things go to waste. But gleaning is a much more positive and sort of morally charged explanation of that same entitlement. So when I first read your work on Soviet things, what you call Soviet things, I really resonated with the way that you also describe people talking about these things that they made in factories or from factory leftovers, in the sense that people observed or seemed to feel that those things were, what they were doing was entirely socially and morally correct. So it just totally resonated with the sort of things that I was seeing. And so I wanted to ask you to say a little more about that.
And vice versa. I mean, so when we started talking about Gleaning 10 years ago, I was writing a historical ethnography of the Soviet economy. And one thing that I was noticing was that I started with these things that people made at the plant and smuggled out, made out of leftovers, actually. Tombstones, knitting needles, kayaks, and all this stuff. And I noticed that when people talked about them, they framed the things themselves in very positive kind of metaphors. Collectivists, kind of, we help each other out, times were tough, yes, but da-da-da. Even though, and they would kind of admit that it was illegal, but it wasn't something that was important. And then when I started thinking about Gleaning, I suddenly saw how the Soviet economy worked. I saw that actually all worked on this logic, and that the logic of taking remainders from the plan and hoarding them and redistributing through personal ties, actually, on one hand, it did keep the planned economy going. Like, we know that, right? Because the system did not work by plan. But on the other hand, there was actually a stated ideology of collectivism. People were literally told to do this. I mean, not, to get kayaks necessarily for their own teams and stuff, although sometimes, yes. I mean, they could be gleaning materials from the plant. This is one of my examples. A guy, an engineer at a plant, smuggled out special hooks for hooking onto rope tows, which he had made at the plant illicitly, again, out of scrap materials, and he smuggled these out in his briefcase for hooking onto rope tows for ski lifts that were set up in nearby Leningrad at the time. What's amazing, though, is that these ski lifts were actually funded by the Institute. The Institute paid for the electricity. So, it's this weird thing where people are kind of illicitly getting stuff from the plant to then use on the plant's own kind of skiing infrastructure. And so I thought all this was really interesting. And Gleaning really, it made everything make a lot of sense. Now, of course, in the Soviet economy, there was no market price. That's what's so interesting about it. It's a totally planned economy. There's market price on kind of small, kind of fringe bazaars, but not for the economy as such. And so I started thinking about use value economies, where if you don't have circulating value that you're supposed to maximize, exchange value, you just have things. And so you're using the things and replacing the things. And inevitably, you will have, something doesn't quite fit what you need, and so then you'll have the remainder. And then, of course, you can somebody else can use that remainder because it seems like it's shame to throw away. What's interesting, though, is that after I finished the book, and we kept talking, we had that Werner-funded workshop where we tried to sort of expand the idea of what Gleaning could be. And I think we both noticed, I definitely noticed, I was surprised by this, by how these same logics are actually all over highly marketized worlds, which I wasn't thinking about in the beginning, because your work is with agrarian economies, or I guess you call them post-agrarian, but there are people still very situated in lived reality. I was working on planned economies, but actually they're all over the place. For example, this is a remainder. We printed postcards to advertise the special issue, and as I was at the printer, the machine made a mistake. I mean, it only printed one-sided. And so they were going to throw this away. And I said, well, can I keep it? And they were very, very happy about this. What I thought was interesting was how excited they were that I wanted this, because actually, they would much rather not throw it away. And I also held this up because I wanted to introduce the special issue as such. It's called Who Gets the Remainder? The Ethics and Politics of Gleaning. And these are our contributors. So it's Amiel. Dan Kainer is a historian of medieval Christianity. That's me. Catherine Fennell, associate, full professor now, I think, of Columbia University, right? Working on Gleaning in Detroit, which we'll talk about a little bit. Tamte Halavashi, talking about gleaning in the city of Tbilisi in Georgia, Cristiano Lanzano talking about artisanal gold mining, Peter Leinbau, the wonderful, of course, social historian of the early modern labor relations, British labor relations, wrote our afterword, and Gustav Peebles wrote our foreword. So there it is. So that seems to be a good transition then to the special issue as such. So one thing I really was surprised by is how much I learned putting together the special issue.
Me too. Yeah.
I actually, first of all, it's a lot of work. For those of you joining us, never do this. Seriously, I mean, at one point I was like, I'll never do this again. But I did learn a lot. And one thing I learned was, that I was surprised by and I had no idea about, was that when people take remainders, they speak a holistic social imaginary into being. They sort of, taking a remainder speaks their participation in a holistic sort of unalienated big economy. And I was hoping we could start to pick that apart. And so I wanted to start with the idea of indeterminate property, which is critical to our introduction, which you've written about separately also through Marx's thoughts.
Yeah, great. Indeterminate property is fascinating. And it's a concept that appears in an early set of essays by Marx, as you know, in which he's writing about the customary right to gather fallen wood. So villagers would gather fallen wood in forests that were owned by private owners, but they had these customary rights of entry for this purpose. And Marx writes this series of essays because a law has been introduced which criminalizes this customary practice. And Marx is like really furious about this. And he outlines indeterminate property as a specific kind of property, which is neither private property nor declared public common property. It's this indeterminate, right? It's in this fringe gray space. And he says this kind of property is customarily allowed to the poor. And this is because it is kind of too accidental, or it's too insignificant, it's too small to be fully kind of regulated, and therefore this sort of space of the gray area is what is allowed for people to gather through these customary entitlements. And so we can think about, so fallen wood is of course a key example in these texts, but we can also think about, he also talks about gleanings, so the harvest gleanings. And he also talks about things like forest berries, things which just doesn't make sense. However, so these indeterminate things by custom belong to the poor, he says, but he's writing in a moment where sort of advancing capitalist enclosure is claiming all of these kinds of things, and he's sort of furious and really enraged in these texts about what's happening, and specifically about the hypocrisy of private property itself, right, which claims that we are all ostensibly equal, we have equal rights. However, in the process is undoing a whole material basis for the life of the poor, what actually allows people to survive and to subsist, which is anchored in these customary rights that are sort of too messy for private property logics. And so Marx thinks this is really, really immoral. And he says that what we see here is that the rights of humans are giving way to the rights of trees. And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the way in which this piece offers something which is so distinct from liberal property forms. And I think you articulate, we talk about this in the introduction, but you also articulate this so beautifully in your essay, how it is specifically that the indeterminate nature of remainders kind of offers a critique.
Yeah, I think this is what's totally critical about the remainder, is that it is indeterminate by nature. It is contextual. So it is literally that which is left over after an operation. And despite whether you've got all these prescriptions about what side of the sickle it falls from, but in the end, it's kind of in the eye of the beholder, actually. So it's not enclosed. And I think what's interesting to me about those essays, Marx's essays, is that he draws a relation between unenclosed indeterminate property and customary use right. So in my essay, in my book, as I mentioned, I was writing about these. I began the book with these stories of things that people made at the plants in Soviet times and smuggled home. Everything, useful things basically for their friends and family. And then I noticed that actually these are not just Soviet things. I was writing the book, I thought these were stories of socialism, but they're not. Unless we want to say that all factory workers are socialists, which we could. But for this essay in the special issue, I went into the literature and I found examples of these things from the early modern era, early modern Britain to the present day. So basically factory workers taking what they claim as scrap remainders, and taking it to make something useful and claiming that they have the right to do this. Was fascinating to me about these stories that I got was that, even in capitalist settings, people don't say, for example, the boss, dispossesses me, screws me over, I'm going to take everything I can. They could. Like, that would also be a normal claim. Why not? But they don't. Inevitably, they say the same thing over and over again and over hundreds of years. So I think there is something there. They say, okay, yes, carrying this stuff out was a problem, but it's not really a big deal. We're just taking the remainders. We've got it's good to do this, and I'm not taking it for sale. Right. I'm taking it to do something good for, everybody, blah, blah, blah. So there is this relation between taking things or using indeterminate property in a way that is not for your own private interest, which intuitively makes a lot of sense. Because if you're using stuff that is not exclusively yours, then it makes sense that you shouldn't use it for your own exclusive good. And I think if we think through the household and the households that we live in, that makes a lot of sense. Like if one of our household members starts like taking eggs from the fridge and selling them for like a private profit, that is, clearly not
right,
not good. Okay. On the other hand, somebody could just invite a guest in and make an omelet, and that would be okay. So to me, what's interesting about indeterminacy and what I think the remainder really gets at, because it is fundamentally indeterminate, is that it makes us think in a fundamentally illiberal way. Because I think as social scientists, we write from a broadly liberal tradition, which emerges from these same enclosure acts in early modern Europe, as property becomes determinate. I mean, this is what Marx sees happening in the mid-19th century with the unenclosed forest. So, I mean, in a way, I think I read those essays as his social history of enclosure happening just right now, right? So our social theory comes out of this moment. Once things become determinate, once you make ownership about possession, then you can make economy about exchange. So you basically, what that enclosure does is it forbids non-owners to use the things that they do not own. And then once you have economies about exchange, then you've got market price. And then interest becomes the social theory about how you understand such a society. And people are acquisitively interested. And this becomes our social theory for understanding the public part of economies organized by markets, or societies organized by markets. So in the public sphere, in politics and economics. And it's a fundamentally different way of thinking. And I think what the remainder asks us to do is to think in this other non-enclosed kind of way. And what was really interesting to me in writing that essay is that I noticed that interests, this fundamental thing that we think about, and also, I must say, also as anthropologists. I mean, anthropologists, we are really good at criticizing liberalism, but all of our concepts are actually transactional. Right. They're about exchange. Right? Exchange and circulation. And I mean, historically, this also makes sense, right? Because early anthropology was tasked with understanding, a primitive economic man. So people who live in non-marketized worlds. And what do? Well, they say, well, it's still about interest. It's just not just material, it's also social. Right? This is Malinowski. It's the basic idea is that it's the gift. It's exchange, it's situated exchange. And I think indeterminate property, the remainder asks us to think in a fundamentally different way, where you're not taking something for your own good, and you're taking of it, your right to the property is always inflected with the higher aim for which you will be using it. And I think that is something I learned writing the special issue.
Yeah, and we see that in a bunch of the essays as well, right? We see that in Cassie Fennell's essay where she is writing about people deconstructing houses with the goal of saving these materials, right? Even in this kind of sacrificial sense where they're talking about in some cases sacrificing their own health in order to preserve these things for a greater good. So even when there is market exchange happening, we still see the same kind of logics at work.
Yeah. And I mean, what's interesting is people see this as an obligation.
Yeah.
I mean, so it's not just that I have the right to take this because it's left over, but I have an obligation, like with this poster. Right. I have an obligation to see that it's not wasted. I mean, the guy who was printing it was really, really happy that I could take it because he felt bad throwing it away. Yeah. And I think we see this all over the place also.
Yeah. I think the obligation piece of it is so interesting too, because I mean, and in a way that moves against a little bit the biblical prescriptions, because in the biblical prescriptions, it's the obligation of the landowner to redistribute, right? But in so many of the cases of gleaning that we have observed, it's the obligation of the gleaner, right? It's the obligation of the gleaner to preserve the use value. So the sort of locus of obligation shifts in a way that I actually think opens up this more collectivist social imaginary visionary than even the sort of biblical framings around gleaning do.
I was going to briefly go back to the Bible, if possible. So one of our essays is Dan Kainer, who is a scholar of early monastic Christianity. And we're also, I think we're both really excited to actually have a real historian.
Totally.
So, it's hard for anthropologists to get historians really committed to our projects, but Dan was great.
Especially the ancient world.
Of ancient worlds, yeah, so cool. And so one thing I think is really interesting that he shows the thing that's really interesting that he shows in his essay is that, okay, yes, you had people using remainders, of course, especially in poor agrarian worlds. There's not a lot of material stuff, and we noticed that. I mean, across the history of agrarian labor relations, you always have somebody picking up what's left over from inefficient field harvesting methods. But he says what's interesting with the Judeo-Christian tradition, when it emerges, is that this becomes a moral requirement. And in different ways. There's like in Judaism, it's one thing, in Christianity, it's universalized. But he says in the classic world with the Greeks and the Romans, there's this understanding that yes, poor, miserable people will want to rifle through your trash, but there's nothing particularly good about this. And so I think what's interesting is that it's not only that the remainder creates this holistic imaginary, but also that once you are in a holistic imaginary, once you are in an imaginary with monotheism, where you think that the world in the end belongs to a benevolent God who wants everybody to be happy and share of the resources, then you have gleaning as a moral demand. So it's linked.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You mentioned before also that you learned something.
Yeah.
So picking up on that, I was thinking that one thing that I really learned and that kind of surprised me across all of these essays was the extent to which people expressed a sense of joy, a sense of pleasure, a sense of real dignity or freedom in taking the remainder. Again, to come back to the sense that this is a positive claim, right? It's a positive claim to the right to be provisioned, and it's a positive claim on the preservation of use value, which I think is really interesting. And it seems. I mean, really, again, reading these essays, I had the sense that not just in my own work, not just in your work, but really across so many different contexts, there's a sense that the asserting the right to take remainders, it works against some kind of alienation. It works against the alienation of labor relations, works against other kinds of things.
And when that shifts, people are really visibly upset about this. So one of our essays is by Cristiano Lanzano, and it's really interesting. He shows actually a transition point. He's talking about artisanal gold mining in Africa, where it's at one point a new method of dealing with the leftovers is introduced, and they become much more valuable. You can get more gold out of them. And when that happens, the person running the illegal operation or the artisanal operation, it makes everybody work for money. Like they cut out before the workers would get paid with remainder, with just the rock. So they would all, there'd be one guy who would get capital together to open the mine, and then everybody else would work. And if they found gold, and they shared, based on what they got, the what do you call it? The undistilled rock. And so it's indeterminate. Afterwards, he started just paying them the gold that was actually, so he could monopolize the whole process and just pay them. And what Cristiano says is that people really felt cheated.
Yeah, they felt their status had been downgraded.
Yeah, which is fascinating.
I think so too. Yeah, and we also see this in Tamta Khalvashi's essay. She writes about, again, the sense of like joy and pleasure and dignity that comes out of doing this. So she follows a scrap metal gatherer in Tbilisi, who of course is doing this work as a livelihood, but is also really committed to a sense that what they're doing in gathering scrap metal is repairing the city, is aesthetically beautifying the city. Right, again, this kind of sense of a higher aim, a goal, which is more than simply self-provisioning or simply preserving things from being wasted. And we saw so many examples of this in your essay, so I wanted to ask you to talk about a couple of those examples from your own essay in the issue.
Well, in your essay too. Sure, but I can talk about mine. What I found interesting across this big historical archive of hundreds of years of factory workers taking these things home is that they don't when they're talking about these things, they don't talk about themselves as alienated labor. And I think that's what the indeterminate relation, that's what the remainder lets them do. I think that's why it's a moral economy. I mean, so they talk about themselves as having a right to the plant. And so, I mean, even though of course formally they're just very poorly paid factory workers by taking the leftovers. They get a stake in the enterprise itself. And there's a really interesting quote that I got from Peter Leinbau, who wrote our afterword, beautiful afterword, from the early modern dock workers in London, who back then they could take what they called chips. So this was like a customary use right, which were remainders. So, of course, they were building boats out of wood, and the leftover wood they could take home. And the management of the plant kept trying to enclose these remainders over, decades, generations, and the men kept fighting for the right to take them as remainders. So the employers tried raising their salaries, but the men took the salary and kept the chips. At one point, Samuel Bentham, Jeremy's brother, notes that in the neighborhoods that surround the docks, everything is made out of wood that is exactly 3 feet long. So like staircases, windowsills, because at that point, like 3 feet, that was the maximum you could take.
Yeah.
Right? So of course, people tried to get away with as much as they could under the idea of chips, but they're also taking chips as remainders. And there's a really interesting quote in Peter's work where the men are mutinying. I think they're striking, but they're striking for the right to take chips. And at one point, the Riot Act is read to them. I mean, so they, because it's a military navy yard that they're working at. So the state's trying to get them back to work. And the workers say, there is not a man amongst us who would not freely die for king and country. But we are. What are you? No, we're not slaves. What's that? You don't remember? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, but I mean, they basically say, but we're not. We demand this as our right because we are not slaves. We are free men. So there's There's an interesting link between freedom and taking the remainder, because taking the remainder is sovereign. You decide what is left over and how much you can take, and it's obviously contested, but you're making that claim that it is a remainder, and that you have a right to it. And I think we actually feel this from our own working lives very much. I mean, if you work in an institution where you must just work and leave, it feels quite alienating. I think if you are in an institution where you have access to the coffee machine and you can like invite your friends in, and it feels very different. So one of the examples that we open with actually is not from the ethnographic record. It's a personal story. And it's a story of my friend who shall remain nameless, who is a publisher and was once an academic. And what's really interesting about the story is that in the first draft of the essay, I wrote the essay with a bit more detail. And of course, I didn't, say the name of this person, but I did say the field in which this person worked. And the one comment I got was, please anonymize more, because, this is potentially a big problem for me. I could get in trouble for it, which I think is just fascinating because it shows how these relations are actually illegal at the same time that they're clearly right. So what this friend of mine, what he or she did was that, he or she was working in the publishing house that published this book. In academic books, they have a very short shelf life. So once sales fall, they go to print on demand because it's expensive to warehouse them. And so all the remaining copies are destroyed. And a friend and a coworker of my friend noticed his or her book on the kill list and alerted him. Actually, I think we say that it's a he in the special issue, so I'll just drop the anonymity. This is silly. But he alerted him in time to intercept him. And I visited him at work, and he gave me, a copy of the book. And I'm like, oh, this is great, but like, I'll just read the PDF. I mean, this thing must cost €100 or more. And he said, no, it's I saved it from the shredder. It's free. So he's got a box of these books. They're great books, and I really wish I could, propagate them and like tell you about it, but I can't because he will get fired. And I think this gets at the really fascinating conflict between market economies and use value economies, and about what the remainder gets at. Because most people, unless they're hardcore business people, and certainly I think the vast majority of academics will say that, yes, it's right to save your own book.
Totally. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, just to kind of To summarize, I think one of the things that I really learned from this, or what doing all this work has opened my eyes to, is just how much indeterminate property there is in the world. There is so much. Suddenly you look everywhere and you see actually private property has this kind of hegemonic claim on our imagination, but in practice, people are doing things which are so radically different all the time. And so, I mean, I certainly hope. But if there's one thing I really hope from this special issue, I mean, there's many things I hope, but if there's one thing I would really like for everybody to kind of start seeing indeterminate property in the world. So,
And actually, as I learned from you, from that first essay on Gleaning that kind of kicked us off, the one you published in 2020 in Cultural Anthropology, it's a point of view.
Right.
So, so in that essay, you're talking about the fuel economies, and what I really thought was quite interesting was that the people that own the trucks talked about it in liquid flows, like our trucks are leaking, we're losing value. The people who gleaned talked about solids. So it's really, but it's the same relation, whether it's theft or it's gleaning, whether it's leaking or it's solid, whether it's determinate property or indeterminate property. In the end, it's in the eye of the beholder.
Nice. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you all for joining us. This has been an episode of Talk On. We're coming to you from Halle, Germany. Please join us next time for the next podcast.